Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Bruce Luzzi. I am the Director of Field Development for Sound Agriculture, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to ask Dr. Fred Bilo to speak to you today and for you to learn more about the important role that nitrogen plays in photosynthesis and yield of corn. After Dr. Bilo's presentation, we'll have a bit of time for questions, and I will likely start out by asking a few questions myself. Um, as many of you may know, Dr. Fred Bilo is professor of plant physiology at the University of Illinois. Dr. Bilo creates strategies to teach farmers and agricultural professionals the value of crop management decisions and develops systems to sustainably produce high-yielding corn and soybeans. He evaluates environmental, genetic, and management factors that impact the productivity of corn and soybeans. Welcome, Dr. Bilo.
Thank you, Bruce. Hey, and thank you for joining us. I know you have a choice of Learning Center sessions, and I appreciate you choosing this one. Also want to thank Sound Ag for sponsoring me here today. What I'm going to do, since this is a learning session, is I'm going to try and educate you on some of the importance that nitrogen plays in photosynthesis. I'm going to use corn as my example, but a lot of things that I hope to teach you will also apply to other crops. Now, I don't have to tell you that photosynthesis is the whole premise behind agriculture. We're harvesting light energy from the sun, and nitrogen obviously plays an important role in that. So I'm going to try and pose a few questions to you as we go. And my first question is, why is nitrogen so important in the productivity of corn? Well, one of the reasons that it's so important is that it is present in numerous important plant compounds. Nitrogen is a component of proteins, it's in nucleic acids, it's in some of the important crop growth regulators, and as we're going to see, it plays numerous important roles throughout the life cycle of the developing crop. Now, I'm going to briefly summarize these four major roles, and then I'll look into each of these in a little bit more detail. So, roughly speaking, what nitrogen does is it helps to establish establish and maintain the photosynthetic capacity of the plant. That's one of the topics we're really going to dive into today. But that's not the only thing it does. It also helps establish and maintain reproductive sink capacity. And since I'm pretty sure a lot of you are growing the crop for grain, that sink capacity is pretty important. So let me do a little educating here, and let me talk briefly about each of the four important roles for nitrogen. Well, that first one is to establish that photosynthetic capacity. And obviously, the goal here is to make sure that nitrogen doesn't limit the development of that capacity. Obviously, nitrogen is an important component of chlorophyll. It's also present in the enzymes that are necessary for photosynthesis. And what one needs during this establishment is an adequate supply of nitrogen to develop those leaf area, to have those leaves green, to result in higher canopy photosynthesis and ultimately higher grain yield. And I don't think I have to tell you what happens if you have a deficiency of nitrogen. Look, you have plants that don't have as much chlorophyll, they don't have as much leaf area, and I'll guarantee you this is going to have a lower yield. Now, I think you know if you have a situation like this, you can semi-correct it, but you can never go back to the yield you would have had. And so nitrogen is crucial to establish that photosynthetic capacity. Now, once we've established the photosynthetic capacity, then we also need an adequate supply of nitrogen during the season to maintain that leaf area. So on the left, you can see a plant that has an inadequate supply of nitrogen, and I think you know what happens there, leaf firing. So those leaves have fired due to a lack of nitrogen. And associated with that is going to be a decline in the photosynthetic activity. Now let's compare that to on the right, where we've got a sufficient amount of nitrogen to keep those leaves greener longer. That is going to keep photosynthesis and yield potential going into the season. So we need to establish and maintain that photosynthetic capacity. But that's not the only important role for nitrogen. Nitrogen also plays a incredibly important role in the establishment of that sink capacity. And when I talk sink capacity, I'm talking yield. I want you to look at this picture on the left. That is a micrograph of the developing corn ear that you would find on a V10 corn plant. So even during the time that you're establishing that photosynthetic capacity, you're also establishing reproductive sink capacity. So if you look here at this micrograph, these represent reproductive initials. They're what are going to ultimately be pollinated and develop into the kernels. And I don't have to tell you that reproductive kernel initials have a high concentration of nitrogen. They have a high metabolic activity. And guess what happens if you're deficient? You have less of them. Not only can you drop whole kernel rows 2 at a time, but you can have less kernels that develop on that developing ear. So nitrogen is incredibly important in establishing those reproductive initials. Now it's also important in making sure that they continue their development. If you look here on the right, this is an ear at the brown silk stage that has had insufficient levels of nitrogen. And you know what happens if you got a nitrogen deficiency after the crop pollinates? Kernel abortion, or more commonly, kernel tip back. Now, this results in fewer kernels. And since kernel number, seed number, is usually the most important determinant of crop yield, nitrogen is important to establish that sink capacity. Now, once we've established those kernels, then we need to have enough nitrogen to maintain their function throughout seed development. You know how a developing seed grows? By depositing storage products in pre-existing cells. In other words, seeds grow by getting heavier. By the way, sadly, this is the same way that you and I grow. We get heavier. And I can't tell you, I've had a little growth spurt while I've been sequestering at home with this COVID pandemic. That's the way that seeds grow. They get heavier, and you need to have sufficient nitrogen for that. First of all, you need nitrogen to synthesize and have the enzymes that are responsible for depositing those storage products in the cells. And then nitrogen is also a component of corn grain in the protein. And if you don't have enough nitrogen, you have smaller kernels with less protein. Look at the example here in my hand and tell me which one of these sets of kernels is deficient in nitrogen. Notice they're smaller and decrease the yield. So I want to summarize here, and I want to tell you that nitrogen plays 4 crucial season-long roles in the production of corn. It establishes the photosynthetic capacity, it helps maintain it, it establishes reproductive sink capacity, and then it helps fill those seeds to the highest level. Now, given that, I'm going to ask you another question, and I hope the answer to this question is obvious. The question is, when does nitrogen need to be available for maximum uptake to the plant? Well, and I just got done telling you that it needs to be available season long. So what I'm showing you here is what's called the uptake and partitioning pattern for corn. This would be for a 230 bushel corn crop, although relatively the same pattern would occur at other yield levels. And so what I'm showing you here is how much nitrogen has to be in the crop, pounds of nitrogen per acre, as a function of time. And I've expressed time as thermal time. I've also expressed time as growth stages. So I hope you know that V is vegetative growth stages, R is reproductive growth stages, R1 is when the crop flowers, and then I've shown you where that nitrogen is within the crop, whether it's in the leaf, the stem, the cob, or the grain. And so this is the seasonal pattern of nitrogen uptake over the course of the season and where that nitrogen is within the corn crop. Now the question is, when is the greatest accumulation of nitrogen by the corn crop? Well, it's right here between V10 and R1, between the V10 and R1 growth stage. That's usually the third week of June to the second week of July. That's a 21-day period. Well, that crop has to take up more than 7 pounds of N per day, every day. And that is because right here, we are establishing the photosynthetic potential of the crop. We're making those green leaves that are going to intercept light. Oh boy, this is not the time to be short of N. And this is for a 230 bushel crop. Pretty sure you even need to have more N available there if you're growing more than 230 bushels. So that's the key time that you absolutely have to have the nitrogen available. Now, it's not the only time. If you look here after flowering, notice you still need to have a substantial uptake of N after flowering. And of course, that is going to the developing grain to maintain those seeds to achieve their maximum weight. So while nitrogen needs to be available season long, it really needs to be available here during the V10 to R1 growth stage when we are establishing that reproductive potential. So I want to ask you, I know you have a lot of management practices that you do to increase your corn yield, but what I'm going to tell you is of all the management practices you use, nitrogen is the one under your control that exerts the biggest impact on your crop yield. That's the number one factor that you control. That's why you never grow a corn crop without adding nitrogen fertilizer. Now, another key thing is nitrogen is going to interact with everything else you do that impacts corn yield. Let's think about the other management practices that you do to impact corn yield. And I'm going to very briefly summarize these to you. This is my so-called 7 wonders of the corn yield world. These are the 7 factors that each year have a positive impact on corn yield. I worked on corn long enough that I can give each of these factors an average value. And if any of you know me, I could talk about each one of these factors for an hour. Of course, I don't have time today. I'm just here to show you that nitrogen interacts with all of these other wonders. Every one of these factors that impacts corn yield is influenced by nitrogen. Now, I don't have time today, but on Friday, I'm going to be talking with one of my students about biologicals, and I'll dive a little more into where biologicals play a role in each of these 7 wonders. So one thing I'll tell you is that there are some biologicals that enhance the availability of nitrogen. And so if you think about it, some hybrids use nitrogen differently. If I have more plants, I need more nitrogen. That tillage residue affects nitrogen. And of course, that weather influences the availability of nitrogen. I want to ask you another question. This is a pretty easy one, I hope. And the question is, does weather impact nitrogen availability? Now, think about it, and every single thing about nitrogen is influenced by the weather. Can we apply it? Is it available? Is it lost? Those are examples of weather-nitrogen interactions. And one big effect that weather plays on nitrogen is inducing its loss. Have any of you ever seen this unfortunate scenario? This example of weather-induced nitrogen loss? See the weather-induced nitrogen loss in the picture? That's a bad scenario. And why that occurs, That occurs because nitrogen exhibits an incredibly complex cycle in the environment. This is what makes nitrogen management so challenging. The complex cycle in the environment not only influences how much nitrogen is available for plant uptake, but it also determines its susceptibility to loss. So, nitrogen cycle in the environment. I want to harken back to your high school days in science class, where I'm sure that you saw the nitrogen cycle. And so here's the nitrogen cycle again. And I tell you, it's pretty complicated. And the thing I want to point out here is I want to point out that the corn plant is a fairly small part of the nitrogen cycle. Now, we have to understand the nitrogen cycle a little bit if we're going to understand why managing nitrogen is so challenging and what we can do to try to improve it. So I'll tell you how nitrogen gets in the soil environment naturally. Nitrogen is in the atmosphere as dinitrogen gas. And under natural conditions, all of the nitrogen that enters the soil is from microorganisms. When you take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and you turn it into a solid form in the soil, that is called nitrogen fixation. And when that's done by microorganisms, that's called biological fixation. So nitrogen originates in the atmosphere, and then due to the activity of microorganisms, it's taken out of the atmosphere and put into the soil. Now, there's two ways that microorganisms can do this. One way they can do it is symbiotically. I know you're all familiar with the soybean nodules that symbiotically fix nitrogen. That's interaction between both the host and the bacteria. But the other way they can do it is non-symbiotically. And you can actually have free living microorganisms in the soil that take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and add it to the soil. This is the main way that nitrogen naturally enters the soil environment. Now, there is enough energy in lightning that a little bit of nitrogen can be added from lightning. It's an infinitesimally small amount. You can move nitrogen from one place to another by animals or by fire, but the main way that it enters is from this biological nitrogen fixation. Now, I will tell you that humans have figured out a way to artificially fix nitrogen by using energy in what's known as the Haber-Bosch process. So what the Haber-Bosch process does is chemically fix nitrogen by taking energy and then converting nitrogen out of the atmosphere into fertilizer. And that fertilizer then from the Haber-Bosch process, I think you know this has been credited with allowing agricultural productivity to keep up with the world population. So where is most of the nitrogen in the soil environment? It's mostly present in soil organic matter. 90% of the total N in the soil would be in soil organic matter. And some of that nitrogen in soil organic matter can be released during the season. Now that's called mineralization. It can be released during the season into the two forms that are used by the plant, either ammonium or nitrate. Now, one of the problems that's associated, one of the challenges of nitrogen cycle is that nitrogen can also be released back to the atmosphere. Remember, it starts in the atmosphere, ends up in the soil, but it can also be released back to the atmosphere. And there's a couple of ways that this can occur. It can occur by volatilization. Certain sources of N, if they're on the soil surface, can volatilize back to the atmosphere. And it could also get back to the atmosphere as nitrogen gases by a process called denitrification. That's what occurs if you have standing water. Nitrogen back to the atmosphere, and it's lost. Now, another way that nitrogen can be lost from the rooting zone is a physical process known as leaching. If nitrogen leaches below the root zone, then it's effectively no longer available to the crop. And sometimes this leach ends up in a tile line, ultimately in a stream and in a river, and then the Gulf of Mexico, where it causes all kinds of problems. So one of the challenges to nitrogen is it is subject to multiple mechanisms of loss. Now, there isn't completely bad news, because there are some ways that one can improve the availability of nitrogen. One way is to minimize the loss. I'm not going to talk much about this, but there are chemical compounds called inhibitors. One of them can prevent volatilization losses. That's a urease inhibitor. And then there's another compound that can prevent losses due to leaching or denitrification. So these are chemical ways to minimize nitrogen loss. Another big way that you can improve nitrogen availability is you can apply the right amount of nitrogen fertilizer. Now that's a real challenge. How do you know what the right amount of nitrogen fertilizer is? Well, I'll tell you how most of this is derived. It's derived scientifically by doing what's called a yield nitrogen rate response study. So what one does is they put on different amounts of nitrogen fertilizer and they measure the yield, and they do this over a whole bunch of locations. So this is a study we did over 78 on-farm locations. And then after all that effort, you could use some math to develop a line like this, which is a yield nitrogen response curve. Now, there is some very useful information you can develop out of this kind of curve. The first thing you can see is what's called the check plot yield. And so the check plot yield is the yield I have without the addition of fertilizer N. Or in other words, this is what the soil supplies. And I'm here to tell you, look at the yield. You can have a pretty good yield without fertilizer nitrogen. As a rough rule of thumb, about half the N that the corn crop needs comes from the soil. That's from the soil organic matter and those microorganisms in the soil that can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Now, another important thing you can get from this curve is the yield response to nitrogen and the nitrogen rate that gives the maximum yield. And so if you look in this particular example, 150 pounds of N gives 180 bushels. And you could use that information to calculate what's known as the nitrogen coefficient. So the nitrogen coefficient is the amount of N needed per unit of grain produced. In this particular example, 150 pounds of N is needed to produce 180 bushels, and that gives me a nitrogen coefficient of a little over 0.8 pounds of N per bushel. And these nitrogen coefficients are often used in making fertilizer nitrogen recommendations. So this particular example is the example with no nitrogen loss. What's typically done is this coefficient is increased a little bit. So one might say, I have to apply a pound of nitrogen fertilizer for every bushel that I expect to produce. And then hopefully you take the historic yield of a given field, multiply by that coefficient, and that gives you an indication of how much nitrogen fertilizer you need. It is not an exact science because it's up against the nitrogen cycle. Now, what happens if you look at this curve, you can see that there's a very serious economic implication by not having enough nitrogen as a loss in yield. So sadly, the economic loss from having too little N is greater than the economic loss of having too much N. And as a result, most growers tend to apply a little bit of extra N just in case there is loss. Now, here's another sad fact of nitrogen fertilizer. that I can tell you if by measuring the nitrogen in the plant is only about 60% of the applied nitrogen is actually absorbed by the plant. The rest of it stays in the soil and is subject to loss. So here's an opportunity to increase nitrogen fertilizer use by improving the amount of fertilizer. Now, I said applying the correct amount was one way. Another way you can improve it is to time it with crop uptake. I mean, I told you that between V10 and R1 is the maximum uptake. So if you could make applications to coincide with that time, that helps. I'm not going to talk much more about that. Another way that you can improve nitrogen availability is by placing it near the root zone. I'm going to ask you a question about nitrogen movement in soil. And so my question is, when nitrogen moves in the soil, does it move predominantly vertically? By the way, vertical is the scientific term for down. Does it move vertically down in the soil, or does it move horizontally to the side? Which way does it move? Well, I'm telling you that nitrogen doesn't move to the side, it moves down in the soil. Now, as I showed you, sometimes it moves up into the atmosphere, but that is also vertical. Nitrogen moves down in the soil, not sideways. And because of this, you can see a nitrogen deficiency right to the crop row. So here's an example of this field, got 180 pounds of pre-plant N. And then we had 5 inches of rain in early June, caused some nitrogen loss. You can see it here on the fire end of these plants. But this row right here had an extra 60 pounds of N applied in season as a side dress using a relatively new technology called a Y-drop. And a Y-drop is designed to place the nitrogen fertilizer right along the crop row. By the way, that's where I'm pretty sure the root is. Now let's think about it. If nitrogen moves down instead of sideways, where would the better place be to put an in-season application? Would it be better to put it down the middle of the row here? Or would it be better to put it right along the side of the row? So I'll tell you, we have a research toolbar applicator that we can test this. Here's our research applicator. You'll notice with this research equipment, we can Coulter it right down the middle of the row, or we can Y-drop it right next to the row. I don't have time to show you our data with this, but when we need a side dress of nitrogen, what we have found on average is we get about a 10 bushel advantage of placing it right next to the row where the root is. Now, finally, one last way, and this is not an inclusive list, but one last way we can improve nitrogen availability is, what if we had a technology that would stimulate nitrogen fixing microbes? What if we could take advantage of those microbes that are in the soil to provide an additional source of N? And so this is either to stimulate the ones that are already there, or maybe in some cases actually applying some. Now, I want to go back to the nitrogen cycle, and I want to remind you that there are a lot of microbes in the soil that can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And what if we could stimulate those right next to the crop root? This would be another valuable source of nitrogen. So I'm going to give you a little lesson about corn plant roots. And there's an incredible interaction that occurs in the roots of young corn plants. There's an interaction between the root, the soil, and the microbes. And so young corn roots secrete polysaccharide-rich mucilage and other compounds. And then what happens is there's an interaction with the microbes in the soil that effectively glues soil particles to that root. This is called the rhizosheath. So this rhizosheath, the soil is sheathed in soil. And this rhizosheath is teeming with beneficial microbes. Some of them that can fix atmospheric nitrogen, supplying it right to the root, and others that can actually solubilize phosphorus, which is in the soil. So by enhancing those microbes in that rhizosheath that fix nitrogen, this would be another way to supply nitrogen directly to the corn plant. Now let's think a little bit about phosphorus and other mineral nutrients. And I'm going to pose another question to you. And the question is, how much mineral nutrition is present in soil? And the answer is there's a fair amount. What I'm showing you here, this is for my 6 favorite nutrients. So what I'm showing you here for each of these nutrients is how much of each of these nutrients is actually in the soil. So what you see here, total in the soil, that's pounds per acre. And what I want you to see is there's a lot of nutrition in that top 6 inches of soil. All right, the problem is that that nutrition is not in the form that the plant absorbs it in. Plants absorb nutrients in specific ionic forms and only those ionic forms. So I show you what those forms are here. And then I also show you the amount in the soil that's in that available form. And I want you to notice the amount in the available form is much lower than the amount that's in the soil. And that's especially true for phosphorus. I want you to look at phosphorus, for example, and I want you to see that there's a fair amount of phosphorus in the soil, tied up in the chemical components that make up the parent material of the soil, and there's almost none of it in the available form. So I'm going to pose a question to you. What if I could somehow have a bacteria that helped me solubilize some of this phosphorus which is in the soil and make it into the available form? Phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. So I got a little animation that I'm going to try and show this to you. And so what I'm depicting here is phosphorus that's tied up as part of the soil parent material. So phosphorus binds with calcium and aluminum, and then it's not available to the plant. But what if I could take a soil bacteria or activate a soil bacteria that then secretes acids that can attack that phosphorus granule and release available phosphorus to the plant? That would be an advantage because now I could make use of some of the phosphorus which is already present in the soil. Now I can tell you that this would be a huge advantage to the corn plant because if you look at the phosphorus uptake pattern of corn, I showed you this for nitrogen and now I'm showing it to you for phosphorus. So this is phosphorus uptake in corn as a function of time and again where it is in the plant. And what I want you to notice is that plant has a season-long requirement for phosphorus. Half of the phosphorus the plant needs to be taken up is taken up by after flowering. And that grain has a huge requirement. So any technology we can do to increase the availability of phosphorus right there at the root surface can really play a role in improving phosphorus use. All right, a couple of important issues that I hope will have taught you or at least refreshed you before we get to the questions. I've taught you or told you that nitrogen plays important roles throughout the life of the plant, establishing and maintaining photosynthetic capacity. I've told you that nitrogen interacts with every other management factor that you do to impact yield, especially the weather. And as a result, there's a complex cycle in the environment that influences its availability for uptake and its susceptibility to loss. This is what makes nitrogen fertilizer management such a challenge. The good news, however, is there are some technologies that can improve nitrogen availability. Better rate, better placement, better timing. And then finally, I showed you that there's a wealth of mineral P in the soil. And if you could just even make some of that available through the action of bacteria that are already present in the soil, in that rhizosphere that solubilize phosphorus, well, this would give us another potential source. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're going to take some questions. Again, I thank you thus far for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bushel. You've certainly given us all a lot to think about, both the grower and researchers like myself. So I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to ask you some questions, and I hope some of our viewers take the same advantage when I'm done. But some of them have to do with helping us to further improve products that we're developing, but also bring out some answers to questions that I think may further support the needs of the growers. And one of the things that I heard you mention was the challenge to put out the right amount of fertilizer. And so just a question around that. When a grower is deciding how much fertilizer to put out, what goes into that decision, and can it lead to an issue of over-fertilization, and then what are the potential impacts of over-fertilizing if it is an issue at all?
Yeah, so when growers decide how much to fertilize, they're really thinking of their yield level. And they certainly know that if there's a nitrogen deficiency, they can see it. They can see it as being yellow. So growers mostly say this field has this yield potential. They do a multiplication factor. They say, okay, I can grow 200 bushels. I need 200 pounds of N. And they might tweak a little more in there just in case the environment could support higher yield, or just in case they lose some. Now, obviously, if the price of grain is high, growers tend to put a little more on because, as I showed you, the economic incentive to have more is very high. Now, of course, the problem with over-fertilization is that that nitrogen can be lost. If it leaches, it's a water quality issue. If it denitrifies, it's a greenhouse gas issue. I can't tell you the stringent ways we're being looked at for potentially over fertilizing. So it's a complex cycle in the environment. It's not an exact science. It's hoping the weather cooperates. And I don't have to tell you how often Mother Nature doesn't cooperate. So a lot of growers see it as the major thing under their control, and they're going to make sure they're not short.
Yeah, thank you. I understand. As you are aware, but perhaps some of the viewers aren't aware, is the company that I represent, Sound Agriculture, really takes a lot of pride in developing products based on science. So again, the information that you share is really, really important for a company like ours. And one of the products that we have developed, and it was released commercially for the first time last season, in 2020 season, is a foliar product that is called Source, and it activates the soil microbes, particularly the N-fixing and phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, to access and make available N and P that is naturally present in the environment. We've made sure it's crop safe. We've made sure it's tank mix compatible, and it's got a wide and flexible application window. One of the important things you mentioned was flexibility, because the plant, you said, needs nitrogen throughout its growing season. So can a product like Source provide that flexibility that a grower may be looking for or the crop needs? What are your thoughts on products like ours in relation to flexibility and placement of product?
Yeah, that's a long question there, Bruce. I hope
yeah,
I can
sorry, Dr. Belo.
so I'm going to put Source in the biological category, but as you noted, it's actually a chemistry. And the nice thing about it being a chemistry is, chemistries are pretty easy to define. You know what they do. So Source is a product that's put on foliarly onto the plant. It sends a signal down to the root, and then that root emits compounds that activate those bacteria which are in that rhizosphere. And being a chemistry, that adds a lot of predictability to the whole process. So the way I like to look at Source is it's another, if you will, source of N. So I told you that half the N comes from the soil, half the N comes from the crop. That soil N is dependent on mineralization. That fertilizer N is not that efficient. That's why when we place it right by the row, it helps a little bit. But think about now taking advantage of those nitrogen fixing microorganisms in that rhizosheath. This is another. It's a third avenue of N. So I won't call it insurance N, but it certainly helps me, give me peace of mind that bacteria may actually be adding a little bit of N to the plant when it needs it. And so therefore, with the environment, I don't know if it's going to be lost. I don't know if it's going to be too wet for me to make a side dress application. So here's a technology that gives me a little peace of mind, because it gives me another source or possibility to get N and phosphorus. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. It's enhancing 2 of those bacteria that are involved in 2 of the key nutrients that one may need, and that's flexibility. I think that if any of the growers are aware of how Source is applied, it goes on anywhere from the vegetative stages, V4, V5 with a post-emergent herbicide, all the way up to R1 with a fungicide. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you could use it, and a lot of flexibility then on what it's going to do. If nitrogen is your limiting factor, then I'm going to take advantage of the nitrogen fixing bacteria. If phosphorus is my limiting factor and I got a lot of phosphorus in the soil, then I'm going to take advantage of that phosphorus solubilizing nature. So it's a lot of flexibility and a lot of possibilities for how it might function.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the other things you mentioned, and you showed a long list of different factors, both management as well as environmental factors that influence nutrient availability and likely nutrient uptake as well. One of the, we've used that information again to try to, after we've developed this product, to take care in ensuring that it's being used in situations in which it can be most efficacious. So, a grower has the greatest opportunity for getting a return on his investment. And some of the factors, and I'll mention 3 of them, that we have found to be most influential on the efficacy of the product are pH, organic matter, and CEC. And again, your understanding of nutrient availability and nutrient uptake, do those factors make sense when we're talking about a product like Source that we're saying is making nutrients more available to the plant?
Yeah, you've hit on the 3 things that are most important to me when I look at a soil test result. I don't have to tell you that pH influences the availability of nutrients. Some nutrients are more available at low pH, some at high pH, and so the idea to have a neutral pH to try to enhance the availability of all nutrients, that's textbook soil science. As you change the pH, sometimes you enhance the rate of nitrification, sometimes you change the solubility of phosphorus. So clearly, it doesn't surprise me that plays a big role. That CEC, carbon exchange capacity, that has a lot to do with how the soil can hold on to nutrients, especially cations. And so that's a hugely important parameter when it comes to how the soil is going to be able to bind nutrients. And of course, soil organic matter, that is a lot of nutrition, which is in soil organic matter. And microbes act on that soil organic matter to release some of it into during the year. It's obviously dependent on temperature and on moisture and on the food source that those microorganisms have. And a lot of the food source is what's exuded by the plant root. So I'm not surprised at all. I would think those are the 3 factors that would play a big role in both the need for and the success for technologies like Source.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask one final question to make sure we do leave time for other viewers to ask questions. My final question, I guess, is more of a general one, and it's and not specifically about Source, but products like Source in the category you refer to as biologicals. How do you see a best fit for these types of products when you consider the grower's nutrient management toolkit, if you will?
Yeah, so the biological compounds, they come into a lot of categories, and so again, I'm going to talk more about this on Friday. My student is, and we spend a lot of time trying to categorize them. And you really need to know what it is your product does, so that you know how to position it for the greatest success. I mean, so the products like Source, I think that they're the next level. They're going to bring us to the next yield level. I mean, if you look at how much yield is available in today's hybrids, it's incredible. I mean, look at the difference between the record yield and the average yield. That's over 400 bushels. And so somehow what we need to do is we need to make sure that crop has the senses, the right nutrition right from the very beginning. And then we have to make sure it's not stressed during its life. It's sort of that simple. And so I'm an optimist, and I see this biological world as one way to sustainably help us to achieve high yields. Anything that we can do to rely a little bit less on chemical fertilizers or get more out of the chemical fertilizers, or anything we can do that increases yield also leads to more residue, and that residue is sequestered into carbon, and that leads to better soil health, and it sort of perpetuates the whole system or the whole cycle. So I actually see them as playing a big role in sort of regenerative ag or sustainable ag, whatever you want to call it, to really help us keep being able to produce the yield levels that we really need to.
Thanks for that. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Bilo, for presenting this information to us today. As I said, it's useful to a very broad range of people that are listening to this presentation, whether they be researchers or they be growers. And again, I encourage that, first of all, I thank those of you who spent the time to listen and participate in this presentation, and wish we could do it in person as we've done in the past, but it's a different time, and we're taking advantage of the other technologies that are available to us to bring this information to you. But please, if you have any questions for Dr. Bilo relative to corn and soy production, how to maximize it under your sets of conditions, please take the time now to ask the questions. And if you have any questions about either sound agriculture or the product source, please feel free to ask me about that as well. Again, thank you so much for your participation.